Part 1, The Discovery. Sarah always felt a wave of purpose whenever she walked through the front doors of Maplewood Nursing Home, located in a quiet suburb with tree-lined streets and neatly trimmed lawns. The building itself reflected a classic American style, a red brick exterior, wide front porch, and a sprawling, single-story layout reminiscent of a ranch-style design common in the Midwest. With its white shutters and big bay windows, Maplewood projected an image of warmth and safety, precisely the environment most families hope to find for their elderly loved ones. For years, Sarah had devoted herself to caring for older adults, taking pride in going the extra mile for her patients. She knew everyone's favorite breakfast items: pancakes loaded with syrup for Mr. Anderson, coffee with just one cream for Mrs. Reynolds, and she understood which activities brought them joy. Some residents loved bingo night, others enjoyed watching baseball games on TV, and a few still liked to take part in 4th of July festivities that included sparklers out on the lawn. Sarah's gentle humor and genuine warmth made her a beloved figure at Maplewood. The residents often said she reminded them of a caring granddaughter who never forgot to visit. But on a cool fall morning, just as the leaves were turning bright shades of orange and red, Sarah felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up the moment she stepped into the lobby. Maybe it was the tense hush in the air, or the worried look on the face of the receptionist. Whatever the cause, an unease settled in her stomach that she couldn't ignore. She brushed it off as nerves. After all, Maplewood had been understaffed for months, and stress levels ran high for everyone. Still, as she made her rounds, a nagging feeling tugged at her. Passing the main lounge, she saw familiar scenes: a group of residents sitting in comfy chairs, crocheting blankets for a winter charity drive, while others sipped apple cider. Some staff stood nearby, chatting quietly. At first glance, everything seemed normal. But Sarah noticed Mrs. Johnson, an outgoing resident who used to be the life of every holiday gathering, now sitting alone by the window. The normally cheerful older woman, who had crocheted red, white and blue blankets for Maplewood's 4th of July celebration, seemed withdrawn and tense. Her once bright hazel eyes were clouded with worry, and her hands fidgeted on her lap. Before Sarah could walk over to Mrs. Johnson, she heard a newcomer's voice echo across the hall. "Good morning, everyone." The voice belonged to Angela, a recently hired nurse who had swept into Maplewood with impressive credentials. She boasted a spotless record, strong references, and a can-do attitude that initially charmed the hiring team. Her uniform was always pristine, her shiny nurse's badge reflecting her name in bold letters. Angela flashed a wide smile at anyone who looked her way, praising staff for small tasks and greeting residents with a sing-song tone. On paper, she was the perfect co-worker, somebody who appeared ready to hit the ground running in a facility that desperately needed extra hands. Sarah, like others, had been tentatively optimistic when Angela started. Anyone who could ease the workload was a welcome addition, right? Yet something about Angela's behavior put Sarah on edge. She noticed how Angela's smile seemed to vanish the second someone wasn't watching. Twice, Sarah glimpsed a flash of anger or disdain cross Angela's face, only to be replaced by that polished grin if a staff member or manager passed by. At first, Sarah tried to brush off these moments. After all, everyone has bad days. But the tension in Angela's manner felt deeper, more unsettling. A few hours into her shift, Sarah headed to Mrs. Johnson's room. She found the older woman by the window, once again gazing outside where trees glowed with autumn colors. "Mrs. Johnson," Sarah said softly, "how are you feeling today? Up for a little walk before lunch?" Mrs. Johnson glanced at Sarah with eyes that seemed clouded by worry. "Thank you, sweetheart, but I'm a little tired," she replied, voice trembling. "I think I'll just rest here." Typically, Mrs. Johnson would launch into stories about her younger days, how she met her husband at a 4th of July picnic, or how she used to volunteer at local elections. The quiet, shaky tone was unlike her. Concerned, Sarah gently placed a hand on Mrs. Johnson's shoulder. She noticed the slight flinch. Alarm bells rang in Sarah's mind. Later that morning, while delivering medication to another resident, Sarah overheard Angela speaking to Mrs. Johnson in the hallway. Angela's voice was oddly sweet, almost too sweet. "Come on now, Mrs. Johnson. We don't want to cause trouble, do we? Let's be a good girl and take these pills." Her tone was condescending, like talking to a disobedient child. Mrs. Johnson, looking frail, complied in silence. Angela caught sight of Sarah at the end of the corridor and immediately switched to a pleasant, professional voice. "Hi, Sarah. Getting everything done on time, I hope." Sarah forced a smile, though unease settled heavier in her chest. As the days passed, Sarah's discomfort grew. She saw subtle changes in Mrs. Johnson's behavior, how she seemed to shrink in her own skin, how she'd glance fearfully over her shoulder whenever Angela was near. One afternoon, Sarah spotted faint bruises on Mrs. Johnson's forearms. "Oh, it's nothing," Mrs. Johnson said, tugging her sleeves down. "I'm just clumsy." Sarah knew the difference between the typical bruises that come with age and ones that might indicate a darker cause. Feeling alarmed, Sarah decided to share her concerns with Carmen, Maplewood's head nurse. Carmen listened patiently but hesitated. "Sarah, you know we're all under a lot of strain. Angela's references are glowing, and she's been great at picking up extra shifts. Maybe she's just strict about following routines. I haven't heard any other complaints." Sarah nodded, biting her lip. She didn't want to accuse anyone without concrete proof, especially when Maplewood desperately needed every capable nurse it could find. But Mrs. Johnson's haunted eyes lingered in her mind. Part 2, Deepening Suspicions. Over the next week, Sarah adopted a watchful eye whenever Angela was on duty. She started noticing inconsistencies in Angela's documentation, medication logs not matching the times pills were administered, contradictory notes about residents' conditions. On the surface, these mistakes seemed minor, but they hinted at a broader carelessness or potential misuse of medications. Yet every time Sarah tried to approach the subject, Angela smiled sweetly and brushed it off with a quick excuse. "Oh, I must have gotten the times mixed up. No big deal, right?" Angela's bright exterior didn't fool Sarah anymore. Beneath the surface, something menacing lurked. Some residents, like Mr. Anderson, who was cognitively impaired, became agitated whenever Angela came around. Mrs. Reynolds, who usually enjoyed morning banter, clammed up in Angela's presence. During communal events, like the weekly bingo night, more than a few residents started finding excuses to stay in their rooms if Angela volunteered to assist. One late afternoon, Sarah responded to a call light in Mrs. Johnson's room. As she neared the door, she heard Angela's voice, low and threatening. "Don't forget what I said, old lady. You mention anything to anyone, and trust me, you'll regret it." Sarah froze, heart pounding. Her instincts screamed that she had to intervene, but if she charged in without a plan, Angela might deny everything and become even more careful in hiding her tracks. Summoning a surge of courage, Sarah quietly backed away, deciding she needed irrefutable proof before she confronted Angela or escalated things again with management. She recalled that Maplewood, like many American nursing homes, had installed security cameras in main hallways and some communal areas, especially after a previous incident years ago that required better monitoring. But Sarah wasn't sure how extensive the coverage was or whether the cameras were even functioning properly. That night, Sarah barely slept. She kept replaying Mrs. Johnson's fearful expression, Angela's menacing tone, and her own indecision about how best to protect the residents. She knew the situation might involve serious legal ramifications. Elder abuse is a crime under U.S. law, and states often involve agencies like Adult Protective Services, APS, when they suspect a senior is being mistreated. There was also the Elder Justice Act, which established better frameworks for identifying and prosecuting elder abuse. Sarah resolved that if she found proof, she would bring it to Carmen, Mr. Harris the facility administrator, and if needed, the authorities. The following day, Sarah approached Mr. Harris. He was a kind man, though overworked, wearing a constant look of exhaustion behind his thin-framed glasses. "Mr. Harris," Sarah began, swallowing hard, "I'm worried about Mrs. Johnson. And I suspect Angela might be harming her, and maybe others." She described the bruises, the overheard threats, and Angela's inconsistent records. Mr. Harris's face grew serious. "You realize these are huge allegations," he said. "If we press forward, we're talking about potentially filing a formal complaint, maybe involving APS. That could lead to legal action." Sarah felt a rush of relief that he wasn't dismissing her outright. "I understand," she replied. "But I can't let fear of paperwork or a scandal stop me from helping Mrs. Johnson." Taking a deep breath, Mr. Harris nodded. "We do have cameras in the hallways. If you believe something is happening there, we can check the footage. But we don't have cameras in every room, only those whose families specifically requested them. Let's start with common areas and any cameras placed near Mrs. Johnson's wing." They made a plan to discreetly review the past week's security recordings. Sarah felt a knot in her stomach as she thought of what they might uncover, but she prayed the footage would give them the evidence they needed to protect Mrs. Johnson and any others who might be victims of Angela's cruelty. Part 3, The Evidence. That afternoon, Sarah and Mr. Harris pored over hours of grainy hallway footage in his small office. The atmosphere was heavy, punctuated by the hum of the computer and the occasional sniffle or murmur from them both. At first, the videos showed standard daily routines: staff wheeling residents to the dining area, families dropping off homemade cookies, occasional glimpses of group activities. Then, around the corner of one hallway, they spotted Angela escorting Mrs. Johnson out of her room. Angela's posture stiffened the moment she looked around to check if anyone was watching. Believing she was alone with Mrs. Johnson, Angela reached down and pinched Mrs. Johnson's arm, hard. Even though the camera didn't capture the exact expression on Angela's face from that angle, Mrs. Johnson visibly recoiled, tears brimming in her eyes. Sarah gasped, covering her mouth. Mr. Harris fumbled with the mouse, rewinding and playing it again to be sure. There was no mistaking the aggression. It was plain as day. Further footage showed other troubling moments: Angela shoving a wheelchair too forcefully, slapping at a resident's hand when they tried to stand without permission, whispering something into Mrs. Johnson's ear that made the older woman flinch as if she'd been struck. The abuse was subtle enough that a busy staff member might miss it if they weren't looking for it, but the camera didn't lie. She's been doing this right under our noses," Mr. Harris said, voice trembling. "How many times did we walk past without realizing?" Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. Mrs. Johnson was too scared to speak up. And who knows how many others. They both sat in stunned silence, letting the weight of the discovery settle. This was no longer a rumor or a fleeting suspicion. It was hard evidence of elder abuse, a direct violation of every oath they took to protect their residents, not to mention a direct violation of American laws designed to safeguard seniors. Finally, Mr. Harris cleared his throat. "We have to act quickly, Sarah. First, Angela must be suspended immediately. Then, we'll contact the authorities, talk to APS, and follow mandatory reporting rules. I also need to inform Carmen, the head nurse, and get her on board with a plan to protect Mrs. Johnson and anyone else Angela might have harmed." Sarah nodded, steeling her resolve. "This is going to be a storm, but we can't let that stop us. We need to do right by these residents." Part 4, The Confrontation. Within an hour, Mr. Harris had called a meeting with Carmen and several senior staff members. Angela was summoned into the administrative office, unaware of what awaited her. She strolled in with that familiar sunny smile. You wanted to see me, Mr. Harris? She asked brightly. Mr. Harris wasted no time. Angela, we found evidence that you've been mistreating residents, including Mrs. Johnson. I'm placing you on immediate suspension pending a thorough investigation. Carmen stood beside him, arms folded, nodding gravely. Angela's face blanched. For a moment, real fear flickered in her eyes before she tried to recover with an indignant outburst. How dare you accuse me of such a thing? She turned to Sarah with a look of betrayal. You did this, didn't you? You're the one who never liked me. Cut it out, Sarah replied, her voice sharper than usual. We have video footage of you physically harming residents, Angela. It's over. Angela's composure crumbled. She sputtered excuses, claiming stress, claiming she was misunderstood, blaming short staffing and difficult patients. But Mr. Harris stayed firm. We've contacted law enforcement and plan to notify Adult Protective Services, as required. You'll have a chance to defend yourself legally, but you're not stepping foot in Maplewood again. As security staff escorted Angela away, Sarah's heart pounded with a mix of relief and dread. She was glad the immediate threat to Mrs. Johnson was over, but she knew this was only the beginning. A scandal like this could tear Maplewood apart, inviting lawsuits, public outrage, or even the threat of losing their operating license. None of that mattered more than the residents' safety, but it still loomed over everyone's minds like a storm cloud. Word spread quickly through the halls, Angela was gone. Residents and staff alike buzzed with questions and rumors. Some staff members who had found Angela charming and helpful at first were shocked and guilt-ridden. How could they have missed the signs? Others whispered that they'd had uneasy feelings too but didn't want to stir up trouble. The entire facility felt on edge, as if the floor beneath them had cracked open and forced them to question everything. Part 5, A Community in Turmoil. In the days that followed, families of residents poured into Maplewood, demanding answers. Some confronted Mr. Harris with shouts and tears, terrified that their loved ones might have been targeted. Others threatened to remove their relatives from the facility, fearing more hidden abuse. The local press caught wind of the story. A nurse caught harming seniors in a care home, and labeled it a potential elder abuse scandal. Television vans rolled up outside the building, camera crews hoping for a sound bite. Maplewood staff tried to maintain calm. An emergency family meeting was called in the dining hall. The large space, usually decorated with cheerful holiday banners, like scarecrows and pumpkins for autumn, now felt grim as worried relatives and staff filled every seat. Mr. Harris stood at the front, flanked by Carmen and Sarah. First and foremost, I want to apologize to every resident and every family, Mr. Harris said, his voice echoing off the linoleum floors. We failed to protect some of our most vulnerable individuals. We are cooperating fully with the authorities, and Angela is no longer employed here. We have taken immediate measures to ensure no one else is harmed. A family member raised her hand. How do we know this won't happen again? She asked, voice trembling. My mother can't speak up for herself. I'm scared something like this could be happening to her too, and we'd never know. Sarah stepped forward, heart pounding. I understand your fear, she said earnestly. We're increasing security protocols and cameras, working closely with Adult Protective Services, and retraining our staff to recognize any sign of abuse. We're also inviting residents' families to visit at any time. We want you to see everything we do. Many in the audience seemed unconvinced. Tension buzzed in the air, thick with anger, sorrow, and betrayal. Still, some nodded, relieved that Maplewood was at least owning up to the crisis. Sarah spotted Mrs. Johnson's daughter, tears streaming down her face, offering Sarah a soft nod of thanks. In the wake of this meeting, state officials came to conduct a thorough investigation. Inspectors scrutinized records, interviewed staff, and spoke with residents. They assessed Maplewood's compliance with elder care regulations and decided whether additional measures were necessary under the Elder Justice Act. Adult Protective Services arranged private talks with residents, ensuring anyone who might have been a victim of Angela's abuse could share their stories safely. Meanwhile, Angela faced criminal charges for elder abuse, battery, and violating the trust placed in her by Maplewood. The evidence from the security footage was overwhelming. Sarah tried not to dwell on the impending court proceedings. She trusted that law enforcement and the American legal system would bring Angela to justice. Her priority remained caring for the residents who were still at Maplewood, especially Mrs. Johnson, who needed all the comfort and reassurance Sarah could offer. Part 6: Mrs. Johnson's Recovery. Mrs. Johnson had always been a sociable, light-hearted person, the type who might lead a Thanksgiving craft session or help decorate the nursing home for Veterans Day. Now, she shrank from social events and avoided eye contact. The bruises on her arms faded slowly, but the emotional scars ran deeper. She refused to let anyone new come near her, turning away from staff she'd once happily greeted. Sarah dedicated extra time each day to check in on Mrs. Johnson, especially before meals and bedtime. The older woman was haunted by nightmares, occasionally waking up in the dark, calling out for help in a trembling voice. Sarah would rush to her side, reminding her she was safe. Sometimes, she'd find Mrs. Johnson huddled on her bed, crocheting small squares in a shaky attempt to calm her nerves, her personal therapy, even though she had no immediate plan for what she might do with them. After Angela's removal, Ms. Parker, a social worker from Adult Protective Services, came to meet Mrs. Johnson. They spoke privately in the recreation room, which was decorated with paper turkeys and autumn wreaths. Ms. Parker asked gentle questions about Mrs. Johnson's experiences and feelings. Mrs. Johnson was hesitant, but Ms. Parker's empathetic demeanor eventually coaxed out bits of the story, enough to confirm that Angela had threatened her repeatedly. "We'll make sure you're protected," Ms. Parker said, handing Mrs. Johnson a pamphlet explaining her legal rights under American elder care laws. Mrs. Johnson clutched the pamphlet, nodding silently. Though she still looked fragile, there was a spark of hope in her eyes. The system was stepping in on her behalf, ensuring she was no longer alone. At Sarah's suggestion, Maplewood arranged for Mrs. Johnson to have a bit of therapy, both physical, since she'd become more sedentary under Angela's mistreatment, and psychological. An on-site counselor specialized in senior mental health, introducing Mrs. Johnson to relaxation techniques and group sessions. The group sessions involved a circle of residents, sharing experiences of fear, loss, or trauma, and offering moral support. Sarah participated when she could, listening respectfully. That sense of community and shared healing embodied an American spirit of resilience, neighbors helping neighbors, folks coming together to overcome adversity. Mrs. Johnson's recovery was slow but noticeable. She began leaving her room more often, sometimes venturing to the lounge for morning coffee or to watch a baseball game with Mr. Anderson. On one particularly heartwarming afternoon, the staff organized a small potluck where some residents helped prepare classic dishes: apple pie, mashed potatoes, and a green bean casserole that smelled like Thanksgiving dinner. Encouraged by Sarah, Mrs. Johnson joined in, and though she was quieter than before, she managed a small smile when offered a slice of warm apple pie. Part 7: Rebuilding Trust at Maplewood. While Mrs. Johnson gradually found her footing, Maplewood faced the daunting challenge of rebuilding trust among residents, families, and the community. Rumors of abuse tarnished the reputation of the once respected facility. Some families, frightened or outraged, moved their loved ones to other nursing homes. The staff who remained felt demoralized, worried that any small mistake might blow up into another scandal. Mr. Harris held meetings with department heads, referencing the American legal obligations Maplewood had: mandatory reporting of suspected abuse, background checks for new hires, staff training on recognizing warning signs, and stricter oversight protocols. They installed additional cameras in corridors and common areas, ensuring that no corner would be out of sight. Some staff grumbled about the "Big Brother" feeling, but most realized these measures were necessary to restore confidence. Carmen, the head nurse, implemented a buddy system, pairing each experienced nurse with a new hire so that tasks could be observed and verified. The administration also rolled out training workshops in collaboration with local elder advocacy organizations, teaching staff about empathy, conflict resolution, and stress management. With a national shortage of nurses, facilities like Maplewood often hired staff under time pressure. Now, they vowed never to compromise thorough vetting for the sake of quick hires again. One week, local attorneys specializing in elder law were invited to speak about the Elder Justice Act, explaining how it protected seniors in various care settings. They addressed the importance of reporting concerns not just internally but also to state hotlines or APS if necessary. The presentation was eye-opening for some staff who had never realized the extent of legal recourses available to seniors and their advocates. Meanwhile, Maplewood focused on community outreach. They organized a family open house day, complete with a small barbecue in the courtyard and a raffle to raise funds for better recreational equipment. Mr. Harris welcomed families, giving them tours of newly improved facilities. The courtyard looked lovely with fall flowers and a brand new walkway for safe strolls. Bingo nights were made livelier, sometimes featuring patriotic themes where residents could win small prizes like flags or baseball caps. Over time, these events helped mend some of the fractured relationships with the community, showing that Maplewood was serious about transparency and accountability. During these gatherings, Sarah noticed some families tentatively voicing hope. They saw improvements, not just in the physical security measures, but in the staff's morale. The environment felt more open, and residents like Mrs. Johnson were beginning to share stories of how staff had supported them through the crisis. Such positive experiences boosted Maplewood's chances of recovery in the public eye. Part 8: A Shift in Sarah's Life. For Sarah personally, the entire ordeal proved transformative. She found herself grappling with late-night anxieties, images of Mrs. Johnson's bruises, Angela's threatening whisper, and the guilt that she hadn't acted sooner. There was relief, too, that she had eventually stepped forward, but the emotional toll left her drained. Outside of work, she confided in her close friend, Marissa, a pediatric nurse at a nearby hospital. "Sometimes I feel like I should have been able to stop Angela the moment I sensed something was wrong," Sarah said one evening, sipping a cup of herbal tea in her small apartment. Marissa shook her head. "You did more than most people would have," she reassured Sarah. "You followed through when it mattered. That took a lot of courage. You saved Mrs. Johnson and who knows how many others." Sarah also encountered an unexpected surge of attention from local news outlets, who painted her as a hero nurse exposing elder abuse. She felt uneasy with the label hero, but recognized the importance of sharing the story to raise public awareness. One TV station invited her for an interview to discuss the warning signs of elder abuse and how families could stay vigilant. Sarah was nervous, but her heartfelt sincerity struck a chord with viewers. The clip circulated widely on social media, prompting messages of support, along with personal stories from individuals who had faced similar horrors. This new role as an advocate tugged Sarah in multiple directions. She still worked full-time at Maplewood and needed to protect her own mental health. Yet she couldn't ignore the bigger conversation swirling around her, how her experiences could help push for stronger measures to prevent abuse in other care facilities. She began attending local health fairs, quietly distributing brochures from elder advocacy groups, and encouraging families to ask tough questions when choosing a nursing home. Back at Maplewood, Sarah sensed a cultural shift. Staff members regularly checked in with each other, asking if anyone felt overwhelmed or noticed suspicious behavior. They established a peer support group that met after shifts in the break room to vent and share coping strategies, like how to handle a combative resident, or how to politely but firmly intervene if they ever saw a colleague acting inappropriately. Carmen even allowed them to post an anonymous suggestion box, encouraging staff to speak up without fear of retaliation. While some employees left Maplewood because they couldn't handle the emotional aftermath, new hires who came in understood the heightened scrutiny. They were introduced to Maplewood's new motto, dignity, duty, and compassion, every resident, every day. It was printed on banners in the hallway and on coffee mugs in the break room. Part 9, Angela Faces Justice. As the weeks turned into months, the legal case against Angela proceeded through the courts. The surveillance footage served as undeniable proof. Several Maplewood staff members, including Sarah, were called to give statements about what they witnessed, Angela's harsh tone, suspicious bruises, and the times she was caught on camera inflicting harm. When Sarah took the stand, she felt a flurry of nerves in the courtroom. She saw Angela seated at the defense table, looking smaller and more subdued than before. But Sarah's resolve never wavered. She calmly recounted the incidents, emphasizing Mrs. Johnson's fear and the emotional turmoil that Angela's actions had caused. The prosecutor highlighted how elder abuse in nursing homes violates the core principles of caregiving, referencing not just state laws but also the broader framework of the Elder Justice Act, which supports investigations into elder abuse and allocates resources for prevention. Angela's defense lawyer tried to argue that Maplewood was understaffed, that Angela was overworked, that this was a case of misinterpreted gestures. But the recorded evidence told a damning story. In the end, Angela was convicted of multiple counts related to elder abuse and assault. The judge delivered a sentence that included prison time and mandated her to never work in a caregiving capacity again. The verdict brought a collective sigh of relief to Maplewood. Staff who had doubted Sarah or felt conflicted about Angela's dismissal now realized the gravity of the situation. Families clung tightly to their loved ones, grateful that justice had been served but shaken by how easily such abuse could hide behind a friendly facade. Part 10, Toward Healing and Hope. As winter approached, Maplewood prepared for the holiday season. Strings of festive lights adorned the porch, and a Christmas tree went up in the lobby with ornaments donated by staff and residents alike. A sense of cautious optimism replaced the frantic fear of weeks past. The changes in Maplewood, both structural and cultural, had begun to settle into daily routine. The administration implemented monthly, safe care audits, checking if staff were following all protocols and if residents felt comfortable. The entire staff, from nurses to cafeteria workers to maintenance personnel, received training in empathy and crisis intervention. Mrs. Johnson continued her path to recovery. Though she sometimes had flashbacks, therapy sessions helped her cope. She started joining small group activities again, like the occasional bingo night or afternoon tea social, though she sat near Sarah at first for reassurance. The crocheted squares she'd been making in her anxious hours eventually became a warm quilt, symbolizing her determination to stitch her life back together. One day, she gifted that quilt to Maplewood's lounge, hoping others could find comfort in it. Her posture became straighter, and her eyes had more life. By the time Christmas rolled around, she was helping hang stockings in the hallway for a secret Santa exchange, something that had always been her favorite tradition. Each time a staff member came by, she offered a polite nod, no longer trembling at every approach. Sarah's heart swelled with pride for her progress. Mrs. Johnson was not just a victim, she was a survivor. As Maplewood regained stability, Sarah sometimes reflected on how quickly trust could be shattered and how hard it was to rebuild. She realized that no system is foolproof, and even rigorous hiring processes can fail if someone is determined to hide their true nature. It reinforced her belief that vigilance and an atmosphere where people feel safe speaking up are crucial. On a personal level, Sarah discovered new strengths. She'd always known she loved helping others, but now she recognized that advocacy could extend beyond Maplewood's walls. She began volunteering once a month at a local senior center, offering educational sessions on how to spot potential abuse, what families should look for in caregiving facilities, and how to contact adult protective services. Her sincerity and first-hand knowledge resonated with many who attended. The more Sarah spoke out, the more she realized the magnitude of elder abuse nationwide. Countless seniors suffer in silence, sometimes in prestigious retirement communities, other times in humble family homes. She felt determined to be a voice that encouraged bystanders to act. "If you see something off, say something," she would tell people. "You might be the only advocate that person has." Within Maplewood, the effects of the scandal lingered. Some residents remained cautious, especially those who had initially liked Angela's friendly facade. The staff, under Carmen's leadership, made it a priority to hold small monthly gatherings where each resident could voice any concerns. Families were invited to join, creating a transparent forum. Problems that once might have gone unnoticed were now tackled early, whether it was a simple misunderstanding or a staffing shortage that left residents feeling neglected. By spring, Maplewood had completed its final round of official state inspections, and the facility managed to maintain its license. In fact, the inspectors noted a significant improvement in staff training, record-keeping, and resident satisfaction. They wrote in their final report that Maplewood had demonstrated a commitment to addressing systemic issues and fostering an environment of safety, respect, and vigilance. Sarah recalled a particularly moving moment when Mrs. Johnson, standing beside her, read a short thank you note during a staff appreciation event. "I was lost in fear, and you all brought me back," Mrs. Johnson said quietly, her voice echoing in the recreation room, where a small crowd had gathered around plates of cookies and fruit punch. "I'm not the same person I was before, but I'm stronger now. And I know Maplewood is stronger, too." The applause that followed felt like a release of tension, a validation that all the changes, the new policies, the increased surveillance, the staff training, the endless discussions, were making a difference. People hugged Mrs. Johnson, tears shining in their eyes. Sarah felt an ache in her chest, the good kind that comes from seeing a painful chapter end with unity and a renewed sense of purpose. Epilogue, a message for everyone. By summer, Maplewood's courtyard was in full bloom, flower beds filled with geraniums, daisies, and marigolds, all meticulously tended by the residents who liked to garden. The facility buzzed with plans for a 4th of July cookout, complete with grilled hot dogs and a small fireworks display at dusk, safely arranged in the parking lot, away from the building. A newly hired activities coordinator scheduled music sessions where residents could sing along to old classics, from "God Bless America" to "Take Me Out to the Ball Game," while staff clapped and swayed. Sarah found herself reflecting on the journey Maplewood had taken since Angela's arrival and downfall. Through heartbreak and betrayal, they had forged a path toward a stronger, more vigilant community. Though the scars remained, especially for Mrs. Johnson and the residents directly harmed, there was a shared resolution to never let such abuse go unchecked again. The story spread beyond Maplewood, inspiring other nursing homes to review their own procedures. Some implemented better staff support systems, while others invested in more comprehensive camera setups. Advocates for seniors cited Maplewood as a case study in how a facility can right its course after a grave breach of trust, provided it confronts the issue openly and works tirelessly to ensure it never happens again. Sarah continued her advocacy work part-time, collaborating with local NGOs focused on elder care. She delivered presentations at community centers, reminding people that the American spirit of independence and community action needs to extend to looking after our seniors. She cited the Elder Justice Act and recommended that everyone learn how to contact adult protective services in their state. "One phone call can change a life," she'd say, recounting how her own decision to speak up was all that stood between Mrs. Johnson and ongoing abuse. For a while, Sarah considered leaving Maplewood, maybe finding a calmer job, or one less emotionally draining. But she couldn't walk away from the residents she'd grown to love. Instead, she found new motivation in helping Maplewood uphold the highest standards. She worked with the administration to strengthen peer mentorship among nurses, reminding them that having each other's backs goes beyond tasks. It means watching for warning signs, stepping in when someone is too stressed, and maintaining a zero-tolerance stance on any mistreatment. Now, whenever she saw Mrs. Johnson in the hallway, sometimes happily chatting with Mr. Anderson about last night's ball game or enjoying a slice of apple pie, Sarah remembered how fragile trust could be, and how crucial it was for caregivers to protect that trust. She also felt a swell of gratitude for the American legal and ethical framework that, once triggered, had come to Mrs. Johnson's aid. Agencies like APS and the entire justice system served as powerful allies when people like Angela slipped through the cracks. A few months later, Maplewood launched a small YouTube channel, intending to showcase daily life at the nursing home, activities, success stories, staff introductions, and short interviews with residents who wanted to share their life wisdom. Sarah, initially camera-shy, agreed to help with the content. In one segment, she spoke directly to the camera. "Hi everyone. I'm Sarah, a nurse at Maplewood. We wanted to give you a glimpse into what real elder care looks like. It's not always picture perfect, but every single day, we're committed to keeping our residents safe and happy. Here's the truth: if you suspect abuse, at any nursing home, hospital, or even in a private residence, don't stay silent. Call Adult Protective Services in your state. Talk to the staff, talk to the administration, and if you feel no one is listening, reach out to local authorities. One person's courage can make all the difference." That's exactly how we discovered abuse right here at Maplewood and were able to stop it before it got worse. Our residents depend on us, and we owe it to them to create a place that feels like home. We've all learned that it's never wrong to speak up when you see someone in trouble. And if you're caring for seniors anywhere in America, remember, our elders deserve dignity, respect, and the very best we can give them. The video ended with snapshots of residents enjoying group exercise, holiday parties, and quiet moments of companionship, bingo nights, baseball games on TV, and even a clip of Mrs. Johnson crocheting in the sunlit recreation room. The channel quickly garnered supportive comments, with viewers sharing their own experiences or praising Maplewood for turning a horrifying event into a catalyst for positive change.